The snowstorm had raged through the night, blanketing the neighborhood in a heavy, unbroken sheet of white. Morning light filtered through a leaden sky, casting a muted glow over the quiet street. The houses, lined up like weary old sentinels, sagged under the weight of snow-laden roofs. Faint wisps of smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint sound of a distant radio mingled with the rhythmic scrape of a lone snow shovel. At the far end of the street stood a modest house, tucked at the corner where the sidewalk curved sharply. Its wooden siding, once painted a cheerful blue, had faded to a weathered gray. Icicles clung to the edges of the eaves, glinting coldly in the pale sunlight. The driveway was buried under thick mounds of snow. And the small front garden, a space that had once been the pride of the neighborhood, lay forgotten beneath layers of frost. Inside, Mr. Samuel sat by the window, wrapped in an old woolen cardigan that had grown too big for his frail frame. His hands, gnarled by arthritis, rested on the arms of his chair as he gazed out at the street. A deep weariness seemed to hang over him, as though the weight of the years had settled into his very bones. He could see the snow piled high against the garden gate, the trellis barely visible beneath the frost, and the faint outline of his flower beds all abandoned to the whims of winter. The garden had once been his sanctuary. For decades he and his late wife Margaret had tended it with loving care, transforming the small space into a haven of color and life. Roses climbed the trellis in bursts of red and pink, while marigolds, snapdragons, and lavender lined the paths. Even in autumn, the garden had been alive with chrysanthemums and the rustle of golden leaves. But those days were long gone. Margaret had passed 6 years earlier, and though Samuel had tried to maintain the garden in her memory, his health had slowly betrayed him. Now the garden was little more than a shadow of its former self, and Samuel found it harder each year to muster the strength to care for it. The snow only deepened his sense of isolation, trapping him inside the quiet house where silence seemed to stretch endlessly. Across the street, Owen was stirring a pot of oatmeal in his tiny kitchen. The smell of cinnamon filled the air, though it did little to mask the chill creeping in from the drafty windows. Owen lived in a one-bedroom rental that could generously be described as cozy. It was sparsely furnished with second-hand pieces, a worn sofa, a lopsided bookshelf, and a coffee table he'd once salvaged from the curb. He spooned the oatmeal into a bowl and set it on the counter before sitting down with a sigh. Winters were always hard on him. Work dried up as the cold set in, and his savings, meager at the best of times, dwindled rapidly. Owen had always made a living as a gardener, a trade he loved more than anything else. There was something sacred about working with the earth, coaxing life out of soil and seed, and watching it flourish under his care. But as much as he loved his work, it wasn't a steady career. This winter had been particularly harsh, and the snowstorms had left the neighborhood almost entirely buried. Owen stared out the window as he ate, his eyes wandering to the house across the street. He had seen Mr. Samuel now and then, shuffling to the corner store or sitting on his porch during warmer months. The older man rarely spoke to anyone, but Owen had heard whispers from neighbors about his late wife and the once famous garden he had let fall to ruin. Today the house looked desolate, its driveway choked with snowdrifts and its windows fogged with frost. Owen frowned. He hadn't seen Mr. Samuel outside in days, not since the storms had begun. A flicker of concern stirred in his chest. Setting his empty bowl in the sink, Owen pulled on his coat and boots, grabbed his snow shovel, and stepped outside. The icy wind bit at his cheeks as he crossed the street, but he ignored it, his gaze fixed on Mr. Samuel's house. The driveway was his first target. The snow was heavy, but Owen was used to physical labor, and he fell into a steady rhythm. His shovel crunched into the snow with each movement, sending sprays of white into the air. By the time he finished the driveway, his breath came in short puffs of steam, and his fingers ached despite his thick gloves. Still, he wasn't done. Owen paused to glance at the garden, or what little he could see of it under the snow. The trellis was leaning at a precarious angle, and the flower beds were hidden beneath layers of ice. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the path and carefully brushing snow away from the edges of the beds. He didn't know much about Mr. Samuel beyond the whispers, but something about the garden stirred a sense of purpose in him. Inside, Mr. Samuel had been watching. At first, he assumed the sound of shoveling was one of the neighborhood teenagers, perhaps looking to make some quick money. But when he peered out the window, he saw Owen instead, a man he vaguely recognized from across the street working diligently without a word. Samuel's chest tightened as he watched Owen not only clear the driveway but also pause to uncover the edges of his long-neglected garden. By the time Owen reached the porch, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the snow-covered street. He knocked gently, stepping back to wait. The door opened a crack, and Mr. Samuel's lined face appeared, his expression one of cautious curiosity. "I didn't hire anyone to shovel," he said, his voice rasping slightly. "You didn't need to," Owen replied with a smile. "I saw the driveway and thought I'd lend a hand. I hope you don't mind." Mr. Samuel opened the door a little wider, his eyes narrowing as he studied Owen. "You're the gardener, aren't you? From across the street." "That's right," Owen said, brushing snow off his gloves. "Owen McAllister. Nice to meet you." Samuel hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Well, come in then. I can't let you freeze out here after all that work." The house was small but warm, with walls lined with photographs and bookshelves stacked with old gardening manuals. A pot of tea sat steaming on the stove, and the smell of something faintly floral lingered in the air. Mr. Samuel moved slowly, leaning on a cane as he gestured for Owen to sit at the kitchen table. As the two men sipped tea, Samuel opened up about the garden, how he and Margaret had poured years of love into it, how it had been the pride of the neighborhood, and how he could no longer keep it up. "These hands," he said, holding them up with a rueful smile, "are no good for much anymore." Owen listened quietly, his heart aching at the older man's wistful tone. When Samuel finished, Owen set down his cup. "You know, the garden's still got good bones. I could tell just from what little I saw under the snow. If you'd like, I could help you get it back in shape once the weather warms up." Samuel's eyes softened, and for a moment he seemed to look younger, more alive. "You'd do that?" "It'd be my pleasure," Owen said. "No charge. Just a neighbor helping a neighbor." Samuel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I won't let you do it for free, young man. But if you're willing to take on an old garden like mine, I won't say no." As they talked, the weight of winter seemed to lift just a little. The two men, strangers only hours earlier, found themselves bound by a shared love for the earth and the quiet satisfaction it brought. Outside, the snow began to fall again, but inside, warmth and hope bloomed anew. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple act of kindness had planted the seeds of a friendship that would soon change both their lives. The days grew colder as winter dragged on, but Owen and Mr. Samuel's tentative bond began to take root. Owen often found excuses to stop by the older man's house, checking in to make sure he had enough firewood, bringing him fresh bread from the local bakery, or simply shoveling the driveway again after another storm. Samuel never asked for these visits, but he never turned them away either. It wasn't long before their conversations began to stretch longer than the time it took to drink a cup of tea. Samuel shared stories from his youth, of his early days as an apprentice carpenter, of meeting Margaret at a local dance, and of the way she could make anything grow with what he called her magic touch. "Margaret used to say a garden is just a reflection of your heart," Samuel mused one afternoon as he and Owen sat by the fire. "If you care for it, if you're patient and willing to get your hands dirty, it'll reward you 100-fold. I never had her knack for it, but I loved helping her all the same." Owen, who was carefully repairing a crack in one of Samuel's old wooden planters, glanced up. "Sounds like she knew what she was doing, and it sounds like you two made a good team." Samuel smiled, his lined face softening. "We did. I'd give anything to have those days back." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken longing. Owen cleared his throat and set the repaired planter aside. "Well, when spring comes, we'll get this garden of yours looking like it used to. Maybe even better." Samuel nodded, his eyes brightening ever so slightly. I'd like that. It's been too long since this place had any life in it. As the weeks passed, Owen began to notice small changes in Samuel. The older man seemed to sit a little straighter, to linger a little longer by the window as he watched the snow melt away in patches. He even mentioned, during one of their conversations, that he'd been digging through the attic and had found some of Margaret's old gardening tools. They're old, but they're good quality, Samuel said one afternoon, holding up a pair of rusted pruning shears. Thought you might find some use for them. Owen took the shears with reverence, turning them over in his hands. The handles were worn smooth, the metal tarnished with age, but there was something deeply personal about them. I'll take good care of these, he promised. And we'll put them to work come spring. Samuel chuckled. I'd say Margaret would like that, but if I know her, she'd probably just tell you to stop talking and get to work. The joke drew a laugh from Owen, but it also deepened his resolve. This wasn't just a garden he was helping to revive, it was a piece of Samuel's life, a living memory of the love he and Margaret had shared. The first hints of spring arrived in mid-March, when the sun lingered a little longer in the sky and the snow began to recede in earnest. On a clear morning, Owen loaded his wheelbarrow with tools and bags of compost and crossed the street to Samuel's house. Samuel was already waiting on the porch, bundled in a coat and scarf despite the warmer weather. He waved as Owen approached. About time you showed up. I was starting to think you'd forgotten your promise. Not a chance, Owen replied with a grin. You ready to get your hands dirty? Samuel held up his gnarled fingers. These hands don't do much these days, but I can still supervise. Somebody's got to make sure you're doing it right. Laughing, Owen set to work. The first task was clearing away the remnants of winter dead leaves, broken branches, and the brittle remains of last year's plants. Samuel sat in a sturdy chair by the garden, offering advice as Owen worked. That trellis needs reinforcing, Samuel said, pointing with his cane. It won't hold up another season the way it is. I'll fix it, Owen replied, already making a mental note to bring over his tools the next day. As the days warmed, the garden began to take shape. Owen carefully tilled the soil, turning it dark and rich. He brought over seedlings from his own collection, marigolds, lavender, and mint, and planted them alongside the hardy roses that Samuel had nurtured long ago. By late April, the garden was starting to look alive again. Bright green shoots pushed through the soil, the trellis stood tall and steady, and the faint scent of fresh earth filled the air. Samuel, who had spent years looking at the garden with a mixture of sadness and regret, now found himself smiling each time he stepped outside. One afternoon, as Owen was tying new rose canes to the trellis, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Owen paused, wiping his hands on his jeans as a well-dressed man stepped out of the car. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features softened by a warm smile. Dad, the man called, his voice carrying across the garden. Samuel looked up from his chair, his face lighting up. Jack. Well, this is a surprise. Jack strode across the garden, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel path. He embraced his father briefly before glancing at Owen. Who's this? Samuel gestured toward Owen. This is Owen. He's the gardener who's been helping me out. You wouldn't believe the work he's done. This place is starting to look like it did in your mother's time. Jack extended a hand. Owen, is it? Thanks for looking after him. It's good to know someone's been keeping an eye on him. Owen shook Jack's hand, feeling slightly awkward under the younger man's gaze. It's been a pleasure, really. Your dad's got great stories about this garden. It's been nice to help bring it back to life. As Jack listened to Samuel talk about the progress they'd made, his expression softened. He seemed genuinely moved by the effort Owen had put into the garden and into his father's life. Before he left, he pulled Owen aside. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done, Jack said, his tone earnest. My work keeps me on the road most of the time, and I know I haven't been around enough. But seeing my dad like this, happy and engaged, it means a lot. Owen shrugged, feeling a little overwhelmed by the praise. Honestly, it's been as much a gift for me as it has for him. I love doing this kind of work. Jack nodded thoughtfully before heading back to his car, leaving Owen to wonder about the quiet intensity in the man's eyes. The garden continued to flourish as spring gave way to summer. Roses climbed the trellis in vibrant reds and pinks, marigolds and lavender filled the air with their fragrance, and herbs thrived in tidy beds. Samuel spent hours sitting in his chair, watching as neighbors paused to admire the transformation. One evening, as Owen packed up his tools, Samuel called to him from the porch. "You've brought life back to this garden, Owen," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And you've brought life back to me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Owen smiled, leaning on his shovel. "You already have, Mr. Samuel. This garden, this friendship, it's worth more than anything else." As the two men sat together, watching the sunset cast golden light over the garden, neither of them noticed the sleek black car pulling up to the curb once more. Jack had returned, and this time, he had something very specific in mind. The next afternoon, the familiar sleek black car pulled up once more, and Jack stepped out. This time he carried a leather-bound folder in one hand and a small envelope in the other. The sight of him made Owen pause in his work. He had been carefully pruning the roses to encourage a second bloom. Mr. Samuel was seated nearby, a wide-brimmed hat shielding him from the warm summer sun. "Well, Jack," Samuel called out, his tone tinged with humor, "twice in a week? I might start thinking you've moved back home." Jack grinned as he walked up the garden path, but his focus shifted quickly to Owen. "Owen," he said warmly, "I've been thinking a lot since my last visit. About this garden, about you, and about my dad. And I realized I needed to come back with something important." Owen straightened, brushing dirt off his hands. "Important." Jack nodded, holding out the folder and the envelope. "Here, open these." Owen hesitated, unsure of what Jack was offering. First, he opened the folder. Inside was a set of neatly arranged documents, their headings crisp and professional. His eyes quickly scanned the first page, and his breath caught when he saw the words "business loan agreement," written in bold at the top. He glanced up at Jack, his brow furrowing. "This is," Owen began, but Jack cut him off gently. "It's a small business loan," Jack explained. "I've arranged it through a friend who works with startups. I'll act as your guarantor, so you don't need to worry about collateral or high interest rates. It's $15,000 to help you officially start your own gardening and landscaping business." Owen stared at the papers, overwhelmed. "Why would you do this for me?" Jack smiled, his expression softening. "Because of what you've done here, not just for the garden but for my dad. I've spent years caught up in work, always on the road, always focused on the next deal. And in the meantime, I let him grow lonelier than I realized. Then you showed up, and suddenly he's smiling again. He has purpose. That's worth more to me than anything else. And I think you've got a gift, Owen. You should have the chance to turn it into something bigger." Before Owen could respond, Jack handed him the envelope. "This is separate from the loan. It's $5,000 for you personally, not for the business, just for you. Pay off your bills, get new tools, fix your truck, whatever you need to take care of yourself." Owen's hands trembled as he opened the envelope, revealing the neatly folded bills inside. He looked between Jack and Samuel, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say. It's too much." Samuel chuckled from his seat, his voice warm and reassuring. "Don't let pride get in the way, son. Sometimes when someone believes in you, you just have to let them." Owen shook his head, still struggling to find words. "You've already done so much for me. I don't know how I could ever repay you." Jack placed a firm hand on Owen's shoulder. "You don't need to. Just keep doing what you're doing, put your heart into your work, like you've done here. That's all the thanks I'll ever need." That evening, Owen sat at his small kitchen table, the documents and envelopes spread out before him. He reread the loan agreement several times, as though trying to convince himself it was real. The $5,000 would solve so many problems: unpaid bills, the cracked windshield on his old truck, even groceries that didn't come from the bargain aisle. But more than the money, it was the faith Jack and Mr. Samuel had shown in him that moved him the most. For years, Owen had dreamed of starting his own business but had always felt it was out of reach. Now, suddenly, that dream was within his grasp. With a deep breath, he picked up the pen that Jack had left him and signed the loan documents. His signature felt like a commitment not just to himself but to the people who had believed in him. The next morning, Owen returned to Mr. Samuel's garden, a renewed sense of purpose lighting his steps. He began planting the final beds, adding bursts of marigolds and sunflowers to the borders. Samuel sat in his usual chair, watching with a contented smile. "So," Samuel said after a while, "are you going to take Jack up on his offer?" "I already did," Owen replied, glancing over his shoulder. "Signed the papers last night. It still feels surreal, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to start my own business." Samuel nodded, his pride evident. "You're going to do great things, Owen. I've seen the way you work. You've got the skill, and you've got the heart. That's what will set you apart." The words filled Owen with a quiet confidence, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what success might look like. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. With Jack's support, Owen registered his new business, Owen's Garden Revival. He spent his days designing a simple logo, printing flyers, and building a website. The $5,000 Jack had given him went toward professional tools, replacing the bald tires on his truck, and even hiring a part-time helper for larger projects. Jack used his network to connect Owen with a few clients, and soon, Owen was juggling multiple landscaping jobs. Each client marveled at his attention to detail and the passion he brought to his work. Word spread quickly, and before long he had more projects than he could handle on his own. Despite his busy schedule, Owen continued to return to Mr. Samuel's garden each week. It had become more than just a project, it was a symbol of everything he had built and everything he had yet to achieve. By midsummer, the garden was alive with color. Roses climbed the trellis in full bloom, lavender and mint scented the air, and golden marigolds lined the walkways. Samuel often sat outside, greeting neighbors who stopped to admire the transformation. For the first time in years, the garden had become a gathering place, filled with life and laughter. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Jack returned to the garden with another surprise. But this time it wasn't paperwork. It was a celebration, a gesture to mark the incredible transformation of the garden and the even greater transformation in their lives. By late July, the garden was a marvel of color and life. Neighbors would often slow their walks to admire it, and a few even stopped to ask Mr. Samuel for tips or to leave compliments. His once isolated home now felt like the beating heart of the neighborhood. Children skipped along the paths, admiring the flowers, while Samuel often sat in his garden chair, chatting with passers-by, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Owen's business had taken off faster than he could have dreamed. With Jack's initial help spreading the word, he had secured a steady stream of clients. His schedule was packed with landscaping projects, garden restorations, and even the occasional design consultation. He had used part of his first profits to hire a full-time assistant, a young man named Caleb who had just finished high school and was eager to learn. Still, no matter how busy Owen became, he always made time for Mr. Samuel's garden. It had become more than just a job, it was his anchor. A reminder of the simple act of kindness that had set everything in motion. One summer evening, as Owen finished installing a set of solar-powered fairy lights around the trellis, he heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel. Jack's sleek black car pulled up to the curb, but this time he wasn't alone. His wife and 2 young children stepped out with him, their eyes widening as they took in the vibrant garden. "Wow," Jack's wife said, her tone awed. "This is beautiful." Jack grinned, holding his daughter's hand as they walked up the path. "Owen, you've outdone yourself." Owen, brushing the dirt from his hands, nodded modestly. "I had good material to work with," he gestured toward Mr. Samuel, who sat beaming under the trellis. Jack's children ran to their grandfather, throwing their arms around him with squeals of delight. Watching the scene, Owen felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. This garden wasn't just flowers and soil, it was a place where life and connection could flourish. Jack had brought more than just his family that evening. As the children played among the flowers, he began unpacking a picnic basket filled with fresh fruit, pastries, and a chilled bottle of sparkling cider. "I figured we should celebrate," Jack said, setting the table under the trellis. "This garden isn't just a revival, it's a masterpiece." Owen glanced at Mr. Samuel, who was watching his grandchildren with a soft smile. "I think the credit goes to him. Without his stories and guidance, I wouldn't have known what to plant." Samuel waved a hand dismissively. "Don't let him fool you, Jack. This garden is Owen's work through and through. I just sat here telling old tales while he did all the heavy lifting." As the three men sat together, sipping cider and sharing stories, Jack turned to Owen. "You know, my dad hasn't been this engaged in years. This garden has been a gift for him and for the whole neighborhood. You've done something extraordinary here, Owen." Owen, feeling a little overwhelmed, simply nodded. "It's been a privilege to work on this. And to get to know your dad, it's been one of the best things that's ever happened to me." Jack's expression turned thoughtful. "Have you ever thought about doing something like this on a larger scale? Community gardens, maybe? Or something that brings people together the way this garden has?" Owen blinked, the idea sparking something deep within him. "I haven't, but that's a beautiful thought. I'd love to give something like this to other people." Samuel chuckled. "He's planting more than flowers, Jack. He's planting roots, good, strong ones." As twilight fell and the family gathered their things to leave, Jack pulled Owen aside. "I'm serious about what I said earlier," he said quietly. "You have a gift, Owen. And I'd like to help you expand it. I've been talking to some people I know, and I think we could start a community garden project, something that brings your vision to more neighborhoods." Owen's brow furrowed as he considered the offer. "That sounds incredible, but I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. I'm just getting my feet under me with the business." Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. And know that when you're ready, I'll be here to support you." The next morning, Owen arrived early at Mr. Samuel's house to finish tidying up the garden. As he worked, Samuel came outside with 2 mugs of coffee, his step slow but steady. "Jack sure is proud of you," Samuel said as he handed Owen a mug. "He's been generous," Owen replied. "More than I ever could have expected." Samuel took a sip of his coffee, his gaze sweeping over the garden. "It's not just generosity. He sees what I see. You've got something special. And you've earned every bit of what's come your way." Owen smiled, feeling a sense of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. "Thanks, Mr. Samuel, that means a lot." As they sat together, the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves filling the silence, Owen found himself thinking about Jack's idea. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for the kind of growth Jack envisioned. After all, this garden had shown him that even the smallest seed, given the right care, could blossom into something extraordinary. By early autumn, the garden had reached its peak splendor. The roses were still blooming, their vibrant colors mingling with the golden hues of chrysanthemums and marigolds. The trellis was a centerpiece of cascading flowers, and the herb beds were lush and fragrant. Neighbors had started bringing small potted plants to add to the space, contributing their own touches of life and personality. The transformation had not gone unnoticed beyond the neighborhood. A local community group reached out to Mr. Samuel and Owen, asking if they could host a garden festival to celebrate the space. It was an idea that thrilled Samuel, who hadn't been at the center of such excitement in years. The day of the festival dawned clear and cool, the crispness of early autumn in the air. Neighbors worked together to set up tables laden with baked goods, tea, and fresh fruit. Children hung hand-painted signs that read the Samuel Garden Festival in cheerful, colorful letters. A musician arrived with a guitar, setting up a small corner to play soft tunes as guests arrived. Owen worked tirelessly that morning, arranging the final decorations and ensuring everything was in place. Samuel sat in his favorite chair beneath the trellis, greeting visitors with a mixture of pride and joy. The garden came alive with activity as the festival began. Families wandered the paths, admiring the flowers and snapping photos. Children played games near the flower beds, their laughter filling the air. A group of elderly neighbors gathered around Samuel, sharing memories and stories about the garden's earlier days and marveling at its rebirth. Jack arrived with his family just as the festival was hitting its stride. His wife carried a basket of homemade muffins, and his children ran ahead, eager to find their grandfather. Jack sought out Owen, who was standing near the herb beds, talking to a few guests. "This is incredible," Jack said as he approached. "You've created something truly special here." Owen shrugged, a modest smile on his face. "It wasn't just me. This garden was already special. I just helped bring it back to life." Jack glanced at the crowd milling through the garden, then back at Owen. "You're being too humble. What you've done here, it's bigger than just flowers. You've brought people together. And you've given my dad something to be proud of again." Owen looked over at Samuel, who was laughing with a group of neighbors as he gestured toward the trellis. The sight filled Owen with a quiet pride. "He gave me just as much," Owen said softly. "More, even. This garden taught me what's really important." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I talked to a few people from the community group that's sponsoring this festival. They loved the idea of a community garden project and they're ready to fund it. We could start with this neighborhood and expand from there. What do you think?" Owen hesitated, his heart racing. The idea of creating more gardens like this one, of bringing beauty and connection to other neighborhoods, was both exhilarating and daunting. "Would you be part of it?" Owen asked, meeting Jack's eyes. "Every step of the way," Jack replied. "You've got the vision. I've got the resources. Together, I think we could do something amazing." Owen nodded slowly, the possibilities unfolding in his mind. "All right, let's do it." As the festival wound down and the last rays of sunlight bathed the garden in a golden glow, Owen found himself sitting with Mr. Samuel under the trellis. The crowd had thinned, and the hum of conversation had quieted to a gentle murmur. "You know," Samuel said, his voice soft but steady, "I never thought I'd see this garden like this again. It's better than it ever was, and so much more than Margaret and I could have imagined." Owen leaned back in his chair, taking in the beauty around them. "It's been an honor to be part of it. And it's not over yet. Jack and I are going to start a community garden project. This is just the beginning." Samuel smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Margaret would be proud of you. And so am I." For a moment they sat in silence, watching as Jack's children darted through the flower beds, their laughter echoing in the twilight. The garden, once a forgotten space choked with weeds and frost, was now alive with hope, connection, and purpose. Owen felt a deep contentment settle over him. The journey had been unexpected, but it had led him to something greater than he could have ever imagined. This garden, and the friendship it had nurtured, had shown him the power of starting small, of caring deeply, and of believing in the transformative potential of kindness. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Owen turned to Samuel with a smile. "Here's to planting roots and watching them grow." Samuel raised his cup of tea in a toast, his voice steady and warm. "To roots and to new beginnings." In the glow of the garden's soft lights, surrounded by the people who had become family, the future felt boundless, bright, and full of possibilities.